Chapter 7 is over the use of flavors and flavorings. So, when we talk about flavor and taste, what we're talking about for flavor is the combination of tastes, aromas, and other sensations that are caused by the presence of a foreign substance in the mouth. We eat to survive. We enjoy eating because of the flavors. So, an interesting analogy is flavor is to food what hue is to color and what timbre is to music. It's what makes the food fun, it's what makes it interesting. It's not just we have to eat this to survive, it's we eat it to survive, but also because we enjoy it as well. When we talk about taste, a lot of times when you're first learning about taste, you learn about your taste buds: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami. Those are the 5 taste sensations that your tongue can detect with its taste buds. And I think the first 4 are pretty, I don't think they need any introductions. I don't think we need to discuss them because I think you pretty much know what sweet, sour, salty, and bitter is. Umami, though, that is a word that has Far East origins, and what it roughly translates to is savory. It's the savoriness of a product. The best way I can describe it is those that eat steak, it's biting into that steak for your first time. That savoriness that comes from eating that steak. That's the umami. There are some other ways to bring out umami, but we'll see about working with that during the lab time if possible. So, but those are the basic flavors. But the thing is your tongue can't differentiate. It just tastes sweet. It just tastes sour, just tastes salt, just tastes bitter. It doesn't necessarily have the fine qualities for doing some differentiating for it. And so what we have to turn to is the olfactory system. So most of our tastes and our flavors actually come through our nose. All right. So the food comes to your mouth, you breathe it in, that goes into your nasal passages up to the olfactory bulb to your brain to get registered. It goes into your mouth, you chew, 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 chew. The taste buds are picking up its receptors, and then there's a back door to the nasal passage called the retronasal path that those aromas are working their way up while you're chewing and registering with the brain. And so the combination of what the brain detects as far as aromas and what your taste buds get as far as flavors, that's what registers as flavor. And if you think I'm totally full of it, I'll give you an example that you'll go, okay, that makes sense. Think about wintertime, you got yourself a head cold and you're all stuffed up, right? And then you go and you eat something. It doesn't taste the same. It tastes different, it tastes muted. It's because the mucus and everything that's in your nasal passages is blocking the aromas from going to the olfactory bulb. And so you're not registering that part of the quote taste that you get from that item, which is why when you're sick, the food tastes different because you're not getting that. So hopefully that's kind of one of those aha moments, and it makes sense as to why food tasted different when you were sick, especially when you're all stuffed up. But it's interesting because, like, sweet, there's different types of sweet. Sugar is sweet. Honey is sweet. Maple syrup is sweet, but they're not the same types of sweet. It's through the nasal passage, through your nose, that helps with those aromas that will help to differentiate the sweetnesses between those different ones. A little bit with your tongue, but your tongue is just tasting generic sweetness. It's not necessarily doing a differentiator between those 3 types of sweet that I just mentioned. So there are some things that affect our flavor perception. First off is temperature. You find the colder the product is, it actually stifles the release of the aromas. And so things that are cold are actually less flavorful than things that are hot. In fact, ideally, you want warm is kind of where you want to be if you want to release the most flavor profiles. If you're cooking and working with cold foods, sometimes you need to over season to make sure that you're pulling out the same flavors that you would get when you would season something that is just set up with something that's going to be served warm or hot. The consistency makes a difference. How thick or how thin will show you how food finishes. You know, you have something that's very light in consistency and it just is there and gone. But then you have something that's real heavy consistency. It's there and it lingers. It has that finish that goes along with it. That affects the flavor perception because of the consistency of that product. Contrasting tastes are a great way to affect flavor perception. You want something to pop, throw a contrasting flavor with it. You know, that's why people love sweet and sour sauce. Okay, they have a contrasting taste. It makes it pop, and it's something that gives a ooh moment as far as flavors and stuff are concerned. The presence of fat. People always say fat equals flavor, and they're not wrong. Most flavors attach themselves to fat particles. So if you do something in fat, it's actually bringing more flavor to the table than if you're putting it with liquid. You'll learn in nutrition class, you have fat soluble and water soluble, like vitamins and minerals and stuff. Flavors are similar with that, but a lot of them are fat soluble. And so they heighten, or they are able to really shine when they are in the presence of a fatty item, which again, why we love fried foods, right? Color can also play a role. And it's more of a mental or psychological thing, but it's what you see, and is it supposed to be what you think it is? You know, when you see that bright green cooked broccoli and it looks delicious, it affects the flavor perception. You think, oh, that looks delicious, it's probably going to taste good. If you've got broccoli that's been sitting for too long and now is turned olive drab and looks sickly, you're affecting the flavor perception in your mind, going, okay, that doesn't look good, it's probably not going to taste good. Interesting thing, the research has shown that even having a certain color on a plate or in your dish can negatively affect the customer's perception of the food. And it's a color that is something that there is nothing in nature that is that color that is technically edible. And that color is actually blue. And you might say, well, what about blueberries? Well, think about it. Blueberries are more purple than blue. There's nothing that's true blue that we eat that is not artificially colored, like a cake or something, right? For whatever reason, our subconscious mind sees that and says that's not natural, and it has a negative perception of that food. Even serving something on a blue plate can make a difference in flavor perception. And again, research has shown over decades that that can actually make a difference as far as what people think that food tastes like. Interesting tidbit of information for you. Some compromises to perception. Age. The older we get, the less responsive our taste buds are. So it actually makes sense as to why kids are picky eaters. Their taste buds are more sensitive than what we have as adults. Think about how many things did you not like as a kid? You got brave enough to try it as an adult, and you're like, hey, this isn't bad. For me, sour cream. I hated sour cream as a kid. As an adult, not a problem. I got Mexican food, I got sour cream on it, I'm a happy camper. And I didn't realize it until started looking at, wow, that has an effect on your taste perceptions. It's also why if you're cooking for kids, you need to be conscientious that something that you think is perfectly salted as an adult, when you taste it, might be over salted to a kid because their taste buds are more sensitive than ours. Okay. Health, we talked about. When you're sick, it makes a difference in your perception of taste. So be conscientious about that. The other thing is smoking. Not to get on a soapbox about it, but research shows when you go out and you have a drag off the cigarette, it actually paralyzes your taste buds and makes it tougher for you to taste foods, that perception that goes along with it, which I always found ironic. And I understand, because stress, et cetera, but, in an industry where we rely on our sense of taste, that we go out and purposefully numb it, when it's something that we absolutely need. The other thing I always found funny is that the hospitality industry is the second largest industry as far as percentage of those who smoke. Does anybody want to guess what is the number one industry? And again, it's not hospitality. It's actually healthcare, which again, totally ironic. I understand. But just to get another little tidbit of information. If you do smoke, I'm not telling you you need to stop smoking. I'm not telling you one way or the other. I just want to let you know, you go out for that smoky treat, it is going to affect your flavor perception when it comes to tasting foods, usually for anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes afterwards. So let's talk about how do we flavor foods. So first off, start with simple. Simple is best. Keep it simple, right? Fresh foods in season whenever possible are always preferred with that. Looking at ways to match the flavoring for both the ingredient and the cooking technique so that they make sense and they combine together. Also, your preparation, the size of your cut will affect the perception of taste and texture. Temperature, like I said, also impacts that flavor profile as well. So things to think about when you're looking at putting flavors together. So let's talk about flavoring. So flavoring is an item that adds a new taste to the food, and it alters the flavor to begin with. So flavorings can include herbs, spices, vinegars, condiments. All of those fall under the topic of flavoring. It's adding a new taste to the food matrix. Seasoning, on the other hand, is, when done correctly, enhances the flavor of the food without changing its taste. So if you do it right, when you season something, you are bringing out the flavor that's there. You're not adding a new flavor. Salt is the most common seasoning. Now, if you add too much salt now goes from being a seasoning to being a flavoring, and now you have a salty flavor. So it's a matter of trying to find that balance of what's going to make the most sense when it comes to pulling out flavors. Salt's the most common, but there are two others that work as well. The other two are pepper and lemon juice. So pepper is great. When added correctly, will help to finish a dish and to help give it a good rounded flavor. So it doesn't, like, one of the issues sometimes you have is the flavor starts off really well and then it just drops and there's no flavor at the end. Pepper, when added correctly, and adds this really cool finish and rounds out the flavor of a dish. Same thing like with salt, you add too much pepper, now it's peppery. So you got to be careful that you don't turn it from a seasoning to a flavoring. Lemon juice typically is associated with the bake shop. So if you're trying to enhance flavors of, let's say, a raspberry puree, it makes more sense to add lemon juice to bring out that raspberry flavor as opposed to bringing out salt. It would do the same thing, but that lemon makes more sense as opposed to using salt to bring out that natural flavor. When we look at flavor profiles and such, the best way to describe it, I've always found, is think of it like music. And you have top notes or high notes, middle notes, and low notes. So top notes are the first flavors. It's the first things that you get as far as flavor and aroma. So those are those ones, like citrus is a huge one. Citrus and vinegars are really, really, really big. If you do a bunch of a certain ingredient, that can be a top note or a high note. Maybe you're doing a garlic chicken. Well, of course, you want your top note to be garlic because that should be the first thing that it hits you with when it comes to Your middle note is your second wave of flavors. So those are more subtle. So those can be your onions and garlic and other veggies. It can be other spices and things that are not meant to hit you right off the bat, but just to add those nuances of flavors right after those first flavors come through. And then your low notes are your most dominant lingering flavors. Those are typically like your proteins and such, or whatever your main ingredient is, but it can also round out with other seasonings, other flavorings and such. And then your aftertaste or finish is that final flavor. What stays in the back of your throat, and for how long does it stay there? What we ultimately look for is a roundness of flavor. So it's a unity of the dish's various flavors. It starts off at the high notes, goes to the middle, low notes, and then finishes with the aftertaste. And then we want a depth of flavor, a broad range. So it's not just all the same. It's not just sweet on sweet on sweet. We have a broad range of flavors that are working together, and that makes sense. So that's the way that I like to look at how we pull our flavors together and everything. As far as working with flavors, you can rely, of course, on very classic combinations. Lamb with garlic and rosemary is an example, apple pie and cinnamon. You could amplify flavors by, for example, sprinkling flake salt on meat before serving. So the salt helps to pull out those meaty flavors. Layer flavors. Add lemon rind, lemon juice, and lemon basil to a vinaigrette. And so you have layers of this lemon flavor within that same dressing, So there's other fun ways of how you can make these flavors flow together. Some different guidelines. First off, flavoring should never hide the taste of the primary ingredient. You shouldn't mask it. Make sure your flavors are in balance so they don't overwhelm the person. It shouldn't be used to disguise poor quality products either. Make sure you're using them sparingly with stuff that's going to cook over a long period of time, because if something's going to cook long periods in liquid, the liquid evaporates, but what you put into it doesn't. So things that might be perfectly flavored and seasoned at the beginning, let's say of a braise, 3 hours later when you have less liquid in it, but still the same ingredients, now they're going to be potentially overpowering. So you got to be very careful. Start off slow, add more later when needed. And also make sure you're tasting and you're frequently seasoning your foods during the cooking process. So taste how the flavors develop, especially during these long cooks. It's really cool to see that flavor development that way. Some different international principles for flavors. So there are some different components that distinguish world cuisine. Their primary ingredients, what proteins and starch they use. Any religious influences as far as what's available and not available, when to cook, how to cook. What are their cooking methods? What do they typically do for cooking? What liquids do they use? What fats do they use? And what are their main their go-to flavorings as far as international flavors? So from a quote from Ethnic Cuisine, the Flavor Principle Cookbook, every culture tends to combine a small number of flavoring ingredients so frequently and so consistently that they become definitive to a particular cuisine, which makes sense when you think about it. For example, Greece, tomatoes, cinnamon, olive oil, lemon, and oregano are all indicative of Greek cuisine. Indian, northern uses like cumin, ginger, garlic. In the southern part of India, mustard seed, coconut, tamarind, and chili. Of course, Mexico, tomatoes, chilies, lime, and chili. Those are ones that you hear those and you go, oh, Mexican cuisine, oh, Indian cuisine. They use it so much that it just becomes ingrained that, oh, that's part of that type of cuisine. So let's talk herbs and spices. So the difference between the two is, where do you get it from? An herb is the leaves, stems, or flowers of a plant. The spice is the bark, roots, seeds, buds, or berries of the plant. And so you can get herbs and spices from the same plant. So for example, coriander is a spice, but what you get the herb from that is cilantro. So cilantro and coriander have similar flavor profiles. Cilantro obviously is going to have that plant, so it's going to have, that texture, where cilantro where coriander is a spice and it's going to get ground up or put into a dish and then removed later to impart that flavor profile to it. Herbs can be used either dry or fresh, where spices are typically dry, and it's whether you're using whole or ground. Condiment. So the term condiment actually is a very generic term. That means, technically it means any item that's added to a dish for flavor. So technically herbs, spices, and vinegars are all considered condiments. However, when we think the word condiment, we think of those prepared sauces and dishes that we serve with stuff. So mustard, relish, ketchup, pickles, things along those lines. That's what we think of when we think of condiments, and that's one definition. But technically, anything that we add to a dish for flavor is considered a condiment. The most common seasoning we talked about already is salt, but there's different types of salt. So you have the table salt or culinary salt, which most chefs reserve that for the table itself. They're not using it in the kitchen. The biggest reason is because a lot of times when you're seasoning with salt, you're picking it up with your fingers and sprinkling it on a dish, and those things are so small that they just fall right through. It's the sands of time when it comes to that salt. So that's usually used at the table. You don't see it used a whole lot by chefs unless you are a pastry chef. Then you see it used more often because since it's smaller, it readily dissolves to make it easier to blend in with different breads and pastries and such. Rock salt, you don't see as much. It is something that occasionally is used, but it's definitely one that doesn't get used a whole lot when it comes to salt. The most common, of course, is kosher salt. That's what a lot of chefs use for seasoning in the kitchens. You can also look at sea salts, which are salts that literally come from the ocean. They evaporate the water, whether through mechanical means, such as heat source, or they put them in shallow pools and let the sun evaporate the water. What you have left is the salt from that seawater. And different sea salts, different regions have different flavor properties and even color properties. For example, you get a Hawaiian sea salt. Because of the volcanic activity, it takes a dark gray, almost black color to it. You get into the sel gris and the salt like that, those are grayish. You get into some Normandy salts because there's clay in the ground in the ocean area, that area. You get like an orangish color to the salts. And so you get these different colors, and you also can get other flavor profiles because of the minerals and stuff that go along with it. The two big ones, the sel gris and fleur de sel, are both French in origin. They actually come from the same place. They put the water in those shallow pools and they let the water evaporate. Well, the light flaky stuff actually floats on the top once enough water is evaporated, and that's removed, and that's the fleur de sel, flour of salt. They're like larger, lighter flake type. Then when it's all evaporated, you have this coarser grayish type at the bottom that's scooped out, and that's the sel gris. Both of them, make for great seasoning additions, but again, they come from the same place. The fleur de sel has that little bit lighter, flakier look to it. And then you can do specialty salts, things such as smoked salts, where they take a kosher or sea salt and they're put in the smoker to add that extra flavor profile to it, which is, of course, really popular with meats. Also really popular nowadays with like whiskey drinks and such, because it adds a smokiness to that cocktail that's being created. So a few different types of salt that are possible to use within our industry. Of course, we want to salt food sparingly. We can always add more. You can't take it away. Remember, you got to be thinking about the fact that we do sweat in the kitchen. So we do need more salt to make up for the sweat that's happening. So be careful that we're not over salting because we crave salt because of all of our sweating. Remember, it's always better. If you're going to err one way, it's better to err on the side of under salting, because customers can always add more salt at the table. Once you put too much in it, you can't take it away. Okay. Also, like I said before, more salt might be needed in a dish that's going to be served cold, because you have stifled some of the flavor profile because of it being served cold as opposed to warm or hot. Oils. So oils are fats that are liquid at room temperature. And oils are refined from different seeds, plants, and even vegetables. Different vegetable oils, cottonseed, peanut, grape, sesame, soybean are some examples. Canola is another type of oil. Both of those types are what we would refer to in most cases as neutral oils. So they don't have a huge flavor, but they are meant for cooking because they have what's called a high smoke point, meaning that it has to go to a really high temperature before it starts burning or smoking in the pan. And those are great for cooking. But things such as a nut oil, a walnut, a hazelnut, or other types of nut oils are great flavoring oils. They are not good cooking oils because their smoke point is much lower. So they're going to burn before you can use it to actually cook product in. So a nut oil would be great for drizzling over cooked pasta or using it to make a vinaigrette or something along those lines. Olive oils, of course, there's different types through extra virgin, virgin, and pure. Those refer to the number of pressings and whether heat is applied to it or not. So the first press of the olives gives you your extra virgin. Then you get into your virgin and pure based upon the other pressings that you do, usually with heat, to extract more of the oil that's in those olives. You can flavor oils or infuse oils, such as taking neutral oils and adding basil or garlic or spices or citrus. But the problem is, especially if you do them in-house, is remember a flavored oil is a TCS food or a potentially hazardous food because you create an anaerobic environment that bacteria can grow in. So if you make a flavored oil, you need to refrigerate it. If you buy commercially made flavored oils, they are typically shelf stable, so you can leave them at room temperature. But once you open them, you want to refrigerate them just because of accidental cross-contamination. We don't want bacteria to start growing. So be careful about that when you are looking at if you're doing your own infused oils. Condiments, talked a little bit about some of those prepared items, relishes and pickles, chipotles, chutneys, fish sauce, fermented black beans, ketchups, mustards, soy sauce, tamari, tahini. All of these sauces and different condiments are great ways to add flavor to dishes as well. And they're, again, a pre-made type, prepared type of item too. Vinegars. You have different vinegars that are, again, they're a ferment that's allowed to go sour. So you have wine vinegars that can be made from different types of grapes and wines. To me, my personal opinion, if you're doing a white wine or red wine vinegar, just stay with them. If you are going to use a champagne vinegar or a Bordeaux vinegar or something like that, you're doing it just for marketing purposes on the menu, because I would be hard pressed to see customers that could actually tell the difference with them. Most of the time, you're probably not going to see them be able to tell the difference between a champagne vinegar and a Chardonnay vinegar and just a general white wine vinegar. My personal preference there, my personal opinion on that. So, but wine vinegars are great ways to add some top notes to dishes as well. Malt vinegar, that's kind of like, to me, that's the redhead stepchild of the vinegar world. We know it's there, but we just don't pay attention to it. And it's so distinct of a flavor, you can't replicate it anywhere. And so I always encourage students to expand out your vinegars and, look at malt vinegars for different reasons, because it has that great sweet sour combination that you just can't get elsewhere. Distilled vinegar, that's a lot of times our first experience with vinegar, which is really sad because that stuff is nasty. It has a very high vinegar content, and it has a very, very sharp, with very little flavor to it. A lot of times it's used for cleaning purposes because it's a natural cleaner, but still edible and everything. Or it's used to add other flavors and stuff to it, where they want to add other flavors to the vinegar and they're not wanting to add flavors are already there. So, I mean, we don't use a whole heck of a lot, but it is something that is optional there, so you can use too. Cider vinegars, based off of like an apple cider or pear ciders, are a fun vinegar to play around with. If you like Asian influence, of course, you have your rice vinegars. Flavored vinegars, take any of the above vinegars, add your herbs, your garlic, your basil, et cetera, and you can do flavored vinegars. What's great about those is because the pH is so low, it is shelf stable. It's not potentially hazardous or TCS food. So you can do flavored vinegars and not have to worry about keeping them refrigerated so you don't make somebody sick. And last but not least, there's the balsamic vinegars, one of my favorites. When looking at actual aged balsamics, very, very complex flavors that I love to experiment with because you can do a lot of different things with them. But the balsamics are really one of my favorites when it comes to vinegars in and of themselves. That was chapter 7 over flavors and flavorings, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully you enjoyed the lecture. And again, we'll see you soon for the next lecture.